No, no, no. Que yo no quepo ahí. Són una mica petites. Eli, Carme i Miriam. Tanco jo. Comença l'Eli o com vulguis?
Sí, no, jo crec que l'Eli, perquè és la que explicarà més el petardo.
No, té per aquí.
Bueno, bona tarda. Sí? Sí? Bona tarda. Bueno, moltes gràcies a tots per estar aquí. Ens fa molta il·lusió, després de molta feina, organitzant aquestes jornades i esperem, bàsicament, que sigui del vostre interès, que sigui molt estimulant i que vingueu avui i demà. Jo soc l'Elisenda Díaz, investigadora doctoral de la Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona, vinc del grup de recerca textualitat i juntament amb la Magda Vaz, que ara presentarà la conferència inaugural amb el Trevor, com portàvem les dues molts anys treballant sobre el consentiment, les violències sexuals i els desitjos dissidents, vam decidir crear un grup de recerca, Zones Grises, Laboratorio de consentiment crític, per poder agrupar tots els nostres interessos, activitats, idees, projectes que teníem. I la primera activitat que vam fer va ser al febrer aquí en el centre, que vam plantejar unes jornades d'un dia sota el títol de El consentiment més enllà de la norma. En aquestes jornades no volíem concloure res, no volíem arribar a cap idea fixa de què vol dir el consentiment i el consentiment queer, sinó que més aviat volíem portar el debat que estàvem veient que estava passant a tot arreu, que tothom parlava de consentiment, que creiem que era molt cis, blanc i heteronormatiu i el volíem portar al nostre terreny. Llavors, en aquestes jornades ens vam plantejar moltes preguntes que ens han servit per avui, per organitzar i pensar què volíem plantejar avui i demà. I per exemple, una d'elles era si realment el consentiment com a concepte, com a idea, ens podia servir per pensar els nostres desitjos, el nostre consentiment, tenint unes arrels esclavistes, unes arrels en l'àmbit jurídic, i llavors ens preguntàvem si potser era més útil pensar en el consens o en les cures. No hem decidit abandonar el concepte, llavors hem decidit pensar en els consentiments dissidents. També ens vam preguntar què fèiem amb les violències que rebem com a col·lectiu i amb les violències que patim dins de les nostres comunitats. I finalment, el motiu que ens reuneix aquí és intentar imaginar i pensar uns consentiments, en plural, dissidents que s'escapin dels límits heteropatriarcals. I bé, bàsicament, com veieu en el programa, hem pensat 4 taules per dialogar, per pensar sobre diferents aspectes. Abordarem els desitjos dels cossos dissidents d'una manera materialista i política. També pensarem diferents pràctiques i polítiques pro-sex com a estratègies per veure què podem fer en aquest context actual d'aquest auge de la ultradreta que estem visquent. I també, com veurem aquesta tarda després de la ponència inaugural, com els espais propis, com per exemple les saunes o els espais de cruising, generen codis propis on es possibiliten altres tipus de consentiments que van més enllà del sí i el no verbal. I com ara explicarà la Carme també, tant des del grup de recerca de cos i textualitat com Zones Grises, pensem el cos no des d'una part del pensament o de la racionalitat, sinó des del propi pensament del cos. Hem proposat 4 tallers per poder explorar d'una altra manera els consentiments, els nostres límits, els nostres desitjos i veure aquestes zones grises en el propi cos. I també volia recordar que tenim aquí fora un espai de relatoria on és un paper obert per poder trencar aquestes jerarquies entre la tarima i el públic i volem sentir les vostres impressions, opinions, comentaris, recomanacions per aprendre de cara a les properes, no sé, jornades o projectes que tinguem per saber vosaltres què opinem i també per fer d'aquest espai no un lloc on impartim un coneixement sinó un espai on podem pensar tot i juntes. I res més, espero que... no, sí, m'han dit. Si no voleu sortir a les fotografies, hi ha gomets aquí fora vermells per poder fer... per no sortir a les xarxes, el consentiment, justament. Qui no vulgui es pot posar el gomet, és un codi. Doncs res, moltes gràcies per estar aquí i ens fa molt felices veure-us aquí.
Moltes gràcies i bona tarda a totes. Fa 50 anys moria una dictadura. Avui, 50 anys després, celebrem la dissidència i és una gran responsabilitat que tots tenim, totes tenim. La responsabilitat de seguir explorant què vol dir viure en la dissidència i consentir. És un enorme pes, una gran responsabilitat. Jo soc Carme Font, soc directora actual del grup de recerca Cos i Textualitats que fa 20 anys justament va néixer de la mà de Mary Torres. Avui no pot ser-hi present perquè és a l'estranger, però hi ha altres membres com l'Elisenda, com en Diego, i tenim la gran responsabilitat i l'honor de poder haver estat partícips de la creació d'aquests espais d'afecte i de reflexió que parteixen de l'acadèmia, però també d'una experimentació física. Som professors, professores, persones que venim del món de la cultura, que tenim una especial vinculació amb tot el que significa viure la sexualitat d'una manera dissident, d'una manera no cis-heteropatriarcal i considerem que a part d'una reflexió crítica i intel·lectual, també des de Cos i Textualitat a la nostra activitat que des de fa 20 anys portem speakers de l'estranger, com el Trevor avui, i hem col·laborat amb entitats claus del territori de fora per ser actors, diguéssim, partícips i dissidents en la construcció col·lectiva d'aquests nous efectes. Creiem que el cos és un espai de dissidència íntima, però que a partir d'aquesta dissidència es construeix el nostre sentiment col·lectiu. És un acte polític de reivindicació. Sentir és un acte polític de reivindicació. I crec que avui és un dia especial per poder-lo celebrar i per poder continuar tots i juntis col·laborant i construint aquest sentit de dissidència col·lectiva. Gràcies.
Bona tarda a tothom i benvinguts al Centre LGTBI de Barcelona, a la 6a jornada anual del centre. Moltíssimes gràcies a tothom per venir. Estem molt emocionades amb l'acollida que ha tingut la proposta. Tota la gent que ha vingut de fora, gràcies per venir. Totes les ponents que han vingut també de fora, gràcies per estar aquí i acceptar la nostra invitació. No m'he presentat, soc la Miriam Solá i soc la directora del centre. En primer lloc vull agrair a la Eli, a la Magda i a la Carme i a la gent del grup d'investigació de recerca de Cos i Textualitat per el desafiament que ens van plantejar amb aquesta proposta de pensar el consentiment des de les dissidències sexuals i de gènere, perquè sense el seu repte aquestes jornades no s'haguessin fet possible. En segon lloc, em toca també donar les gràcies a la plataforma LGTBI, que és la plataforma que gestiona aquest equipament, que com sabeu és un equipament municipal de gestió cívica, i recordar que la gestió cívica és una proposta de la nostra ciutat perquè la ciutadania s'impliqui en la gestió dels serveis i dels equipaments públics que està a la nostra carta municipal, que té molt valor i que l'hem de mantenir, protegir i visibilitzar com una proposta de participació molt radical, de participació ciutadana molt radical. I en tercer lloc, i per suposat, vull donar les gràcies a tot l'equip del Centre LGTBI, perquè no podem tenir un millor equip, més apassionat, més compromès i molt exigent a l'hora de plantejar una programació de molt nivell i engrescadora, sempre amb humilitat, amb cura, amb escolta i amb una qualitat humana i conceptual de la que aprenc cada dia. El sentit d'aquestes jornades sempre ha sigut, des del seu inici, la possibilitat d'agafar un debat social important, de calat, i poder-lo abordar des d'aquesta mirada de la diversitat sexual i de gènere, que és una mirada que va molt més enllà de les pròpies sigles LGTBI. Agafar aquest debat, poder abordar-lo en profunditat i des de 3 dimensions que quan col·laboren crec que són molt productives. La dimensió de l'activisme, la dimensió de l'acadèmia i de la recerca i la dimensió de la política pública, que també són les 3 dimensions que volem que acompanyin tot el que es fa des d'aquest centre. És també un joc complicat, no? I és també el repte que planteja la pròpia gestió cívica quan es fa des d'un activisme i una militància, però has de donar un servei públic i has de fer política pública. No és fàcil, són equilibris de vegades complicats. Aquí tenim també companys que han estat presidint també la plataforma que ha gestionat el centre i m'estan fent així amb el cap. Com molt bé ha explicat la Eli, el concepte de consentiment sempre ha estat lligat a un marc heteronormatiu i ja era un imperatiu poder abordar-lo des d'aquesta altra mirada. També sabem que de vegades aquest debat sobre el consentiment ha generat moltes polaritzacions i moments dolorosos i complexos i difícils. I precisament amb aquesta jornada el que volem és canviar el focus per fugir d'aquests enfrontaments i apostar per idees noves que sumin reflexions i plantegin altres mirades. A més, en un context d'alta vulneració dels drets de les dissidències sexuals i de gènere, de fortes desigualtats socials, on l'extrema dreta està buscant impulsar aquest pànic moral i reconfigurar el panorama polític per consolidar jerarquies i desigualtats, nosaltres pensem que precisament aquesta nova mirada al consentiment també pot ser una eina de transformació. Res més que tornar-vos a donar les gràcies a totis i desitjar-vos que pugueu gaudir molt de les jornades i que siguin molt profitoses i endavant amb el Trevor, benvingut.
Organització i vinc a introduir a Trevor Hoppe i després cedirem l'espai per a que ens pugui presentar aquest llibre tan meravellós i al final farem una miqueta de preguntes i sobre els dubtes que tinguem. I'm going to do this in Catalan, your presentation, and then after we will talk in English. Trevor Hoppe és professor associat de Sociologia a la UNS de Greenboro, és autor del llibre Punishing Disease, HIV and the Criminalization of Sickness, obra que ha rebut diversos reconeixements, incloent-hi el Premi Lambda. També ha coeditat 2 llibres, The War on Sex, amb el David Halperin, i Unsafe Words, Queering Consent in the MeToo Era, amb Chantel Gabriel Bax, sobre el qual es basarà aquesta xerrada. El llibre examina com el moviment MeToo ha definit el consentiment des d'una perspectiva sovint heteronormativa i limitada i reuneix veus queers que qüestionen aquests marcs, proposant un enteniment del consentiment més complex i relacional. A través d'assajos crítics i experiències personals, l'obra ensenya com les perspectives LGBTQ poden ampliar i enriquir el debat actual sobre el desig, els límits i la justícia sexual. Li donaré pas a Trevor i ens veiem a les preguntes.
Gracias. Good afternoon. Moltes gracias. That's the extent of my Catalan. Forgive me. Muchas gracias. Thanks to Magda and everyone of the organizers. This is a fabulous event, and I'm so grateful to be here. Today I will reflect on my own life experiences, as well as those of my colleagues, drawing from the collection of essays that we referenced, Queer and Consent, Unsafe Words, Queer and Consent in the MeToo Era, which I co-edited with my colleague, Chantal Gabrielle Buggs. The book brings together queer and feminist perspectives on consent in the long shadow of MeToo. Un momento. Well, no, not at all. You good? Sure. Yeah, okay, we'll do it again. I get to practice my Catalan again. Good afternoon. Moltes gracias y muchas gracias to Magda and everyone here at the Barcelona LGBTI Center for inviting me to help kick off this fabulous two-day event. And thanks to you all for coming. It's a real honor, to say the least, to be here with you today in Barcelona. Today, I will reflect on my own life experiences, as well as a little bit of those of my colleagues who worked together to produce this book, Unsafe Words, Queer and Consent in the MeToo Era, which I co-edited with my colleague Chantal Gabrielle Buggs, who is fabulous. Look into her work as well. The book brings together queer and feminist perspectives on consent in the long shadow of MeToo. I'm speaking here from the United States context that looks a little bit different than Spain's recent solo CSC debates, but many of the tensions around consent, criminalization, and queer sex will feel familiar. My hope is not to map US answers onto Catalonia, but to think together about what consent can look like when so many of us are still in different ways feeling our way in the dark. It's okay. I will continue here, I think, if that's okay. It's okay. Yeah. Hey. Before I get ahead of myself, I want to first preface my talk by noting that, this talk is about sex. I don't usually give explicit content warnings, but today I think it's important. I think the title and description probably clued everyone into the nature of today's talk, but in case it didn't, please know that we're going to talk about sex candidly, including sexual violence and situations that may make some people uncomfortable. And if that's not a discussion for you, I understand if you need to take a break now or at any point in the presentation. I want to start with a story that I tell in my book that I will never forget. Told to me by a gay male mentor of mine who came of age in the 1960s when homosexual was still the official word used by doctors and the media. He was in college when he first fooled around with another guy, but it was only after things started to get hot and heavy that they realized it. Neither of them had a clue what they were supposed to do. Now, sure, they knew what straight sex looked like. Everybody knew that. But when it came to finding pleasure with someone of the same sex, they were in the dark. One of them did have an idea, though, as luck would have it. His friend had heard through the grapevine that gay sex had something to do with Vaseline. The trouble is, he didn't exactly know what they were supposed to do with it. So, without any other ideas on the table, they decided to give it a shot. They found an old tub of the stuff and proceeded to just absolutely smear it all over each other. And I guess wait to see what happened. Every time I think about that story, I laugh. I'm glad you laugh too. I just imagine them writhing around in the slippery paste for hours, bewildered, lost in the dark, but nonetheless, pretty turned on. I love that story because I think that almost anyone who has had sex can relate on some level. Gay, straight, or otherwise, we all learn the hard way that sex doesn't always turn out the way we expected it to. And that's what makes sex so alluring and potentially terrifying. We think we know what we're getting ourselves into, and then suddenly we're covered in Vaseline. Or worse, or better, depends on your perspective. But either way, we're reminded how often we enter sex half-prepared, half-informed, quite literally consenting in the dark. How do you say yes to sex when you aren't exactly sure what you want? How do you say no when a boundary is crossed and you need a situation to end? These are real-life skills that nobody teaches us. Back home in the United States, I teach a class called Sex and Society. And I ask my students every semester on the first day, write down what you wish you had learned in sex education class, but did not. Over the years, I've learned that students are desperate for reliable, accurate information and even the basics. They want to know, what really is an orgasm? How do men and women experience sexual pleasure differently? One female student wrote down this past semester, that she thought it was a joke that men had balls until she was 18. It's funny, but it's pretty telling. Sort of sad reflection on American sex ed. More than just biology, though, my students are also hungry to develop practical skills. How do you know when it's the right time to have sex or the wrong time? And semester after semester, they ask, how do you say no? And that question really gets me. We think it's so easy. But then you're in the moment, ideally with someone whose company you enjoy, and they want to push things further than you would like. How do you slow down? Can we try something else? For many of my queer students in the United States, they're still very much on their own. They're desperate for medically accurate, non-stigmatizing information about their bodies and how to protect themselves and their partners. But the only source of practical information they got before coming to university was a Reddit thread that they stumbled on at 2 a.m. while hiding under the covers, pretending to be asleep. There were no birds and the bees talks from our parents for most of us. There was no lesson in sex ed about how to clean out before you get fucked. We had almost no joyful queer role models on screen. Nothing like the Heartstopper for today's teens, or red, white, and royal blue. I'm not sure if that made it here to Spain, which at least offers a tender, if somewhat PG-13 depiction of gay sex. But the point is, we as queer people and young sexual beings generally are so often lost in the dark when it comes to finding our erotic footing. It takes practice, like a lot of practice. In our introduction to the book, Chantel and I point out that we live in societies that don't flinch at mass carnage on screen, but panic at the sight of Janet Jackson's breast at the Super Bowl halftime show. Sex appears everywhere, but it's scrubbed clean, performed by impossibly young, thin, white, cis bodies. Most of us rarely see our desires, our actual bodies, reflected. Drawing on Judith Butler, we argue that consent is not a one-time contract, but an ongoing embodied negotiation, an exploration of what Butler calls, quote, regions of yes-saying, agreeing, hesitating, fearing, wanting, trying, and revising in real time. In other words, we're asked to navigate highly sexualized worlds with almost no honest language for what we want. Again, we're asked to do consent work in the dark. With so little invested in preparing young people for the realities of having sex in the United States, certainly I can speak to, should we really be surprised at all how terribly wrong things are going? And the data on sexual violence makes it crystal clear. Things very often do go wrong, and women usually bear the brunt of those failures. About 1 in 5 women in the United States will experience an attempted or completed rape in their lifetime. Men are also victimized by rape, but at rates far lower, about 1 in 38. And when men are victimized, the perpetrator is still most often a man, 85% of the time to be precise. Rape is clearly a gendered form of structural violence. MeToo was supposed to be a moment of reckoning, a jolt to the system to try to shake us out of our collective complacency when it came to sexual violence. MeToo activists took to Twitter to name and shame abusers in a public forum, often famous, powerful, straight white men, because the law had done nothing to stop their abuse. Of course, many of you will connect this. I'm sorry, I'm excited. I talk too fast. I'll slow down here. Many of you will connect this to parallel debates here in the Spanish state and Catalonia about sexual violence and public accountability, most famously the La Manada case in Pamplona. I think for many Americans, Me Too felt both extremely relevant, but also very distant. After all, most of us aren't rich, famous actors or executives at Fortune 500 companies. We can't afford to hire PR agencies to court public opinion, nor can we expect to be invited on Good Morning America or Els Matins de TV3 to recount our experiences. But many of us, especially women, will unfortunately encounter some version of a Harvey Weinstein in our lives, an asshole who uses their power to get away with abuse. But as a gay man, I felt removed from the Me Too discussions for another reason. It seemed to be describing a sexual reality that was not my own. Trust me, I half joke that I thank Cher every day that I'm a gay man. I say that because gendered, misogynistic politics of heterosexuality seem to make sex a nightmare. I'm going to return to Jane Ward's essay from Unsafe Words because she captures this tension sharply. She argues that heteropatriarchy ruins straight sex. It makes power a misogynistic minefield and turns even kinky practices into yet another replay of men's dominance and women's submission. So in that context, she says, it makes perfect sense that feminists would demand reciprocity and enthusiastic consent as a basic standard. She says, quote, when you're fucking in the shadow of misogyny, mainstream feminism's modest recommendation that good sex is defined by the presence of reciprocity and enthusiastic consent makes perfect sense. Like Jane, I want to state outright that our critiques of highly heteronormative Me Too discourses do not dismiss the need for serious remedies for heterosexuals. Enthusiastic, explicit consent makes profound sense as a political and educational demand in a world where women and femmes are routinely disbelieved, coerced, and punished for saying no. Clearly, heterosexual culture is in bad need of an intervention. As we say back home, all tea, all shade. But queer people shouldn't have to simply accept whatever remedies straight people cook up to address harms they produced. As Jane Ward reminds us, the straight rules don't apply, the name of her chapter. Tools designed for one erotic regime can misfire when imposed on others. So it's in that spirit that I offer my next set of observations drawn from my essay in the book. In the wake of Me Too, there has been a lot of discussion about what ethical sex ought to look like. And one of the most recognizable forms of that response has been the notion of enthusiastic consent. And just out of curiosity, how many people are familiar with this concept of enthusiastic consent? Okay, a handful. Well, if you haven't, The idea is that we have been far too passive about thinking about what it means to consent to sex. Proponents of the enthusiastic model argue that consent must be more than just the absence of a no. Instead, it ought to be thought of as actively given to partners in an enthusiastic manner, or what one university resource describes as, quote, a continuous state of being between people that actively affirms their wishes. It's checking in with the other person every step of the way, end quote. This notion of checking in is sometimes framed as repeated permission seeking for each and every sexual act. Quote, this concept requires that consent be given to each piece of sexual activity. Here in Spain, from what I understand, you have already lived through a powerful experiment in this direction with the Ley del Solo es sí, which sought to put an affirmative yes means yes standard at the heart of sexual offense law, eliminating the old distinction between abuse and aggression. It was driven by struggles like La Manada and the demand that courts stop reading women's silence or paralysis as consent. At the same time, as you all know better than I do, the law's implementation and later reform sparked intense debate about sentencing, legal technicalities, and what it means to translate a feminist ideal of enthusiastic consent into criminal code. I admit that enthusiastic consent could be useful for sex education. Education requires setting aspirational goals for students to strive toward in their lives. So in America, we teach teenagers in driver's education to follow the speed limit and always have their hands on the steering wheel at 9 and 3. But let's face it, every driver's ed teacher knows that most, if not all, of their students will wind up speeding and occasionally driving with their knees. Enthusiastic consent could be a similarly useful teaching tool for young people in the throes of learning about sex for the first time. But advocates go further to say that we should rewrite rape laws based on this model, enthusiastic model. To me, that's a bridge too far, particularly as a gay man, for reasons I will explain. It felt like a new puritanical sex ideal developed by and for straight people being potentially foisted on everyone. But speaking more broadly, if we're being honest, can we seriously argue that any sexual encounter that diverges from the enthusiastic model is necessarily assaultive or unethical? Wouldn't that wind up labeling nearly all the sex ever had in the world as assault? And if everything is assault, then what isn't? To me, that kind of absolutism wasn't just silly, but wrong. It implicitly equates the lived experiences of sexual assault survivors with garden variety sex. When I think about my sex life and the many experiences I've had, the enthusiastic model looks completely foreign to me. And it's not that I don't have tools for practicing consent. I have safe words with several of my partners, for example. And if you don't know, safe words are kind of like little stop signs you can throw up with a partner when you need an encounter to stop. They're usually words you wouldn't use in casual conversation. I use red just to make it easy. The beauty of safe words is that it allows partners to push your boundaries. That's because I don't always know what I'm going to be up for in a particular encounter. I do have hard limits, of course, that I communicate ahead of time. But there are softer limits, things that a particular partner can push past in the right encounter. Our bodies and minds are sometimes in conflict in intense encounters. That conflict is part of why rigid checkbox models of consent can feel inadequate. In his essay in the book, Consent in the Dark, part of this talk's title is based on, Alex Cheeves speaks to this tension directly. Here talking about fisting practices. He says, quote, in fisting, sometimes my no means stop. Other times, with certain playmates, my no can be overridden, and I accept this. Inversely, sometimes I say yes when my body says no. This happens when there's a tension in my muscles and mind that I can't let go of, which keeps me from fully surrendering. The body nearly always wins, he says, even when I'm begging for it. As an aside, I hope I didn't scare any straight people in the audience away with that story. I did say that I would talk about sex frankly, and to be clear, I do that in my talks not just because it's fun or erotically charged or exciting. Yes, okay, it's that things. It is those things. But it's also important to me because I think shying away from the gory details just ends up reinforcing shame and stigma. Trust me when I say you do not make great decisions about sex when you're terrified or racked with guilt and shame. Okay, back to consent. Queers have developed plenty of tools for ethical sex that get around the need for explicit, verbal, ongoing vocalized consent. So I would wager, for example, there aren't a lot of long, drawn-out conversations going on right now across town at Sauna Casanova. If you are not familiar, Sauna Casanova is your city's, as I understand it, there may be others, premier gay bathhouse. Basically sort of like a gym, but without working out, and everyone's naked, and you walk around in these steam rooms, saunas, hot tubs, and hallways where naked men meet for sex. At Sauna Casanova, you would pay 22 euros for a locker, put all your clothes inside, and wrap a towel around your waist and wander around looking for a mate or two or three. Talking is pretty much a non-starter for most men in these spaces. Instead of words, they use body language, a nod, some inviting eye contact, or a mutual grope. You might hear a discreet hola, but nobody is talking about their weekend brunch plans. Guys who aren't interested will pass at greater distance, they'll avoid eye contact, and move by quickly. Of course, there are guys who push it, who ignore signals of disinterest. Usually, they will stop if you say no thanks while holding up a hand to say no. That's not to say that queer sexual spaces and communities don't have their own problems. To the point of a bathhouse, Blue Buchanan, a Black trans scholar, reflects in their essay on their first visit to such a space, like Casanova, that ended in sexual violence, when someone was more interested in their own pleasure than Blue's boundaries. In their chapter, Blue pushes us to see that consent there is not just an individual contract, but a set of community norms. They argue that, quote, the current structure of community consent falls short because of two overriding assumptions. One, all participants are knowledgeable of the rules of the space and how to engage or disengage with others. And two, breaches of consent are accidental rather than structural or interpersonal attacks, end quote. That leaves almost no structure for learning those rules or addressing harm. Blue asks us to imagine a bathhouse or other queer space that actually teach people how things work and build in ways to respond when they need things to slow down or stop. Blue argues persuasively that community spaces, like bathhouses, can do more to promote ethical sex, to put people on more equal footing when it comes to knowing the rules of engagement inside the hallowed doors of Sauna Casanova. In Unsafe Words, we talk about how some queer spaces rely on dense, shared understandings. Lots of looking, touching, signaling, but very little speaking. That can work beautifully when everyone knows the script, but it can be violent when they don't. So bathhouses like Sauna Casanova are no longer the only stomping grounds of young queer people to figure things out. Today, the internet is a central source of both information and connection. And like young people today, I too learned quite a bit about sex online. And you can bet I spent countless hours scouring the web for information, both practical and recreational. For me, the possibility of having sex as a young person was tantalizing. The taboo mixed with hormones was a heady combination. I started having sex as a teenager in the 1990s in North Carolina, when any sexual act with another man was classified under the law as a felony that carried serious prison time. I would arrange clandestine meetings with men I met online. Driving to their house felt like my heart was beating 1,000 times a minute. What would they look like? Would they be a good kisser? Do I even want to kiss them? As a horny teenager, I'd usually try to make the most of any situation. It was long before smartphones. To have a picture, you would need to have a physical photo that you scanned in and uploaded. Webcams came around at some point, but they were pretty rare for a while. So in other words, when the door opened, you were often in for a surprise. Sometimes better, sometimes worse. I spent my teenage and college years having a lot of sex with strangers. In those early years, I mostly kind of went along with anything. I mean, anything within reason. I didn't really understand labels like top or bottom, labels that gay men have adopted to describe a preference for being the receptive or insertive partner. If a guy asked whether I was liked a certain thing done or in a certain way, what was I really going to say at that point? I mean, sure, I guess I could get into armpits. These formative years are critical to understanding one's erotic self. During the 90s and 2000s, Craigslist was my generation's main tool. Anonymous ads on, quote, men-seeking men boards offered 1,000 little windows into what people actually did in bed, or what they wanted to do. One research participant I interviewed for a study in San Francisco proudly described posting for a blindfolded, quote, cum dump scene, inviting selected partners to enter their home, fuck him, and leave, no questions asked. For him, the anonymity, the risk, the silence didn't reflect an absence of a consent, but the erotic charge, carefully scripted in advance. I doubt the people who promote enthusiastic consent as a universal legal standard have given much thought to cum dumps. Well-meaning as they may be, they often imagine sex only one way, with a partner between one man and one woman, in private, not for money, with a partner whose name you know, narrated step by step out loud. But in many queer and kink contexts, what makes a scene hot is precisely what has been negotiated in advance: the anonymity, the power imbalance, the silence. In that cum dump scenario, the lack of dialogue is not the absence of consent, but the very thing that they consented to. Treating that man as a serial rape victim would completely misread his agency and his desire. I cannot endorse a concept of consent that would render this man a repeated rape victim based on those experiences he described that brought him great pleasure. It just doesn't make a lick of sense to me. My participant is like so many queer people today in that we've gotten pretty good at using the internet to hash out what we're looking for and open to before we meet up in real life. To that point, I can count on one hand the number of times I had sex with someone I did not meet first online. I would need a lot of hands for the opposite. It is extraordinarily rare. And research suggests that my online habits are typical for a queer person. According to a 2019 survey in the United States, more than 55% of LGBT respondents reported using online apps to meet partners versus only 28% of straight respondents. I suspect the rate is even higher if you just singled out gay men. They didn't report that number. But my beef with enthusiastic consent goes even further. Even in the best circumstances, everything can't always be arranged ahead of time. Communication in the moment is key, yes, but in my experience, the communication is often, or sometimes even exclusively, nonverbal. A moan, a nudge, or even a noticeable silence can go far. Over the years, I've learned how to say a lot to my partners without even uttering a word. Is he doing something that you don't really enjoy? Here's how to communicate that you're not really into it without ruining the moment. You could gently guide his hand or his mouth or his body away from one place to another. Is he being too aggressive? Here's how to get him to take it easy. Simply Shifting body weight sometimes can signal, or asking for a minute to breathe. And in rare cases, is he continuing to do something that I've expressly told him not to do? Here's how to get him off you: yelling stop, or if need be, shoving him off you and exiting the situation. I've only had to force a guy off me one time. I was living in San Francisco while going to grad school. I met up with this very handsome man who lived a few blocks away. The encounter began simply enough, with the usual ritual of making out while slowly stumble walking backwards towards the bedroom. And then we started having sex, but I was not ready. It hurt. And I told him to stop. He misunderstood me. I imagine that he thought I was acting out a rape fantasy bit. He whispered, "Oh, no, you don't," and he pushed me down. I'm not sure what I said to him in the moment, honestly, but I do remember that I turned around and shoved him with all my might to get him off of me. He was instantly apologetic, embarrassed. I got dressed and I left immediately, and we never spoke again. I left his apartment feeling conflicted. I truly do not believe that he was trying to assault me, but I do think he took things too far without laying the necessary groundwork, either in advance or in the moment. And I share this story knowing full well that not everyone is physically able to shove a partner around in the bedroom. He was much stronger than me, very muscular guy, but I guess adrenaline helped. I will never know for sure, but I suspect yelling stop could have achieved similar ends. I often compare this failure to an encounter I had years later while visiting Philadelphia. We met on a website called Manhunt, and his apartment was so dark I can barely remember what he looked like. But I do remember that our bodies clicked. Everything felt right. He was assertive, verbal, and a really good kisser. As the encounter played out, however, he got increasingly assertive and dominant, much more so than anything we had discussed ahead of time. And it began to border on a rape fantasy scene. The room was dark, but I can still remember him stopping and looking me in the eye at each juncture, silently searching my eyes as if to say, "Is this okay?" I would try to signal yes with a slight nod. It seemed that for both of us, words would have ruptured the domination fantasy playing out before our eyes. Now, the great irony is that in that moment, while I was theatrically performing a total lack of control and utter submission, I felt fully in the driver's seat. It would take me more than a decade of sexual practice to feel ready to repeat that kind of encounter, to trust myself and a stranger enough to let that scene play out, knowing that I could stop it, knowing how to stop it. It remains one of the most exhilarating sexual experiences of my life. I often think about what it means that one of my hottest sexual encounters was basically a rape roleplay scene. That's a heavy sentence, I know. Let me be clear, rape is a crime and a violation. But what I'm describing is consensual play with the fantasy of losing control, grounded in trust and escape route. That fantasy is not rare. Many people report forced or non-consensual fantasies. Just look at gay porn, which is full of prison rape storylines. The point is not that violence is sexy. The point is that sex and power are entangled, and our consent frameworks have to be sharp enough to distinguish between harm and negotiated power play. Whatever the scene, the underlying fundamentals of consent remain the same. In this case, I knew from our discussions beforehand that he wanted to be in control. I told him that I wanted that. At many times throughout the encounter, he stopped what he was doing, looked directly in my eyes, and checked in with me. Admittedly, what played out was much more forceful and aggressive than I had expected. Maybe than he had expected. But a foundation of trust nonetheless remained intact throughout the encounter, made possible by subtle but present forms of communication and checking in. In an ideal world, we would have had a more formal discussion about what we were going to do and what our boundaries were in advance. These conversations are hard and often unsexy, as Angela Jones shows in her essay on how female sex workers, the real experts on consent, she argues, navigate difficult and sometimes dangerous encounters with a mostly male clientele. She writes, quote, "Conversations regarding consent may not feel sexy at all. They can feel awkward, weird, uncomfortable, and yes, downright mood-killing, especially when they occur during sex. So to the extent that one can, do not worry about being sexy. Worry about being honest, clear, direct, assertive, and true to oneself. Feeling safe, seen, and heard creates the conditions for more pleasurable and, yes, sexier sex." I agree with Angela that conversations in advance are ideal. But I struggle with the reality that most of us do not go into every single encounter as scholars of our own libidos. For some of us, sex is a space for learning a lot about yourself, your deepest, darkest desires, and sometimes, let's be real, to work out some fucked up shit. It's not always practical to expect everyone to be able to speak these sometimes unknown desires verbally, frankly, explicitly, because we are often lost in the dark. A practical concept of consent must be capacious enough to allow for this kind of boundary pushing and spontaneity for those who seek it, while of course respecting harder lines for those who need them. This does not mean that partners should have license to do whatever they want. Checking in, even subtly, is part of sexual communication. Unless they asked you to act this way, bulldozing over a partner's signals and disrespecting them and their wishes is at the very minimum rude, but yes, it can also become assault. I want to conclude here by urging us to think seriously, not just about punishment when it comes to sexual violence, but also prevention. MeToo channeled a long, simmering, righteous anger at powerful men who had gotten away with violence for decades, centuries, let's be real. These men deserved the belated dose of accountability that finally landed at their doorstep. But as satisfying as it can feel to topple a corrupt giant, we cannot punish our way to sexual freedom. We have to stop and consider the current state of affairs. Do we really think young people are given the tools they need to practice ethical sex? I can tell you as an educator on this side of the classroom, my students are crying out for decent sex ed. Every semester, they remind me just how starved they are for medically accurate and practical skills-based knowledge. As a queer person, though, I struggle to feel invested to responses to sexual violence that depend solely on the police and prisons. For many of us, myself included, our sexual lives began with a fear of police. I was 20 years old when the United States Supreme Court ruled that I could have sex with another man without breaking the law, at least on paper. Sodomy laws still remain on the books in the United States. Police still raid gay bookstores and cruising grounds. They still use sting and decoy operations the same way that they did before that ruling. So I know I'm not alone. Here or in Spain, you similarly, I understand it, have problems with police, usually under the guise of drug crackdowns, less, as I understand it, from cruising grounds, but similar kinds of phenomena. So I know I'm not alone here or in Spain in wondering whether the same institutions that have criminalized our sex should be the guardians of our safety. For queer people of color, the ability of the criminal justice system to deliver justice is viewed with suspicion. In the book, I interviewed Dominique Morgan, a formerly incarcerated Black transgender woman and sexual assault survivor who is a leader in the movement for prison abolition. How is it possible that the roots of our liberation are based in pushing back on the police? And we think because we're 52 years from Stonewall that now we've reached a point where the police are now our buddies, she says. The police are never going to make me feel safe as a Black trans woman going on an app, going on Plenty of Fish to date someone. She says, I can't call the cops and be like, hey, listen, I'm gonna meet this guy, police officer. Can I share my location with you? And if you don't hear from me in an hour, will you call and check in on me? She says, I can't do that with the police. I do that with my friends. That's how I feel safe. The police can't give me that. What does it mean to be safe, she says? What does it feel like to be safe? What needs to be in place? For Dominique and countless other queer and trans people of color, safety is rooted not in the state, but in community, in friends who track your location, in networks that will look after you if something goes wrong, in people who believe you without requiring a police report. She asks us to imagine a world where accountability for sexual harm doesn't start and end with calling the cops, but with building conditions in which harm is less likely and survivors have real options. I hope that this book and this conference ignite a broader conversation about how we practice ethical sex without presuming to know what's best for everyone else in every context, including here in Catalonia. Different communities will need different tools to promote and practice pleasurable consensual sex in the dark with imperfect knowledge and real power differences. So what do we do? How do we get to a tomorrow where we all have better tools than no means no, on the one hand, and carceral punishment on the other, and where 1 in 5 women and many men and non-binary people do not experience sexual violence? Sex education must be one cornerstone. Community care and accountability practices are another. I'm sure you have other ideas. I'm eager to hear them. I invite you to think seriously with me and us about what those tools could look like. And I look forward to hearing more from you in our discussion. Thank you.
Some water first. They're going to give you something to translate some questions that are in Catalan for you. Is it working? ¿Sí? Vale. Thank you very much, Trevor, for this presentation. I think it's a lot of information for us. I'm going to try to make maybe 2 or 3 questions and then open the mic to listen to the people. So the first one is how we unlearn what society teaches about consent in the cis, straight, white model. And as we have the representation every day in the TV, and these are the relations that we learn from. How do we unlearn that as it doesn't fit us?
Thank you very much for that question. This is, yeah, working. I'm sorry, I have 2 things, yeah. I think there are a couple things I want to say about that. One is that I think acknowledging first that consent is nonverbal and the ways that that looks in real life is really important to not just teach people about the verbal forms of communication, but also the nonverbal communication, to be able to read people's situations better, to give them the tools to do that in the moment. But I think it's really hard, and in my view, it takes practice and a lot of failure. And I'm failing to this day. I want to be really clear, like this is not something you just perfect over time. I'm thinking yesterday I got a massage in La Rambla, or near La Rambla, and during the massage, it was supposed to be an hour and a half, I was laying there naked, and this man is touching me, and I was uncomfortable. It was not going well. I did not enjoy the massage. I was, in my head, I was playing out, I want this to stop. For 45 minutes, I sat there and I thought, I want this to stop. And then I imagined the relief that was going to come when I was outside of that building. And I knew, oh my God, I have to stop this. Like, this needs to end. But it took me 45 minutes to get there. I'm not arguing that this massage therapist was assaulting me, right? It's just that vocalizing what you want is, or don't want, I should say, is not always straightforward. Some of us are really good about being like, nope, I don't want to do that. And other of us, we're like, well, maybe it'll be fun, I don't know. And I'm kind of somewhere in the middle, so it took me 45 minutes to get there. I don't know, I guess I just want to say that practice is really important. With students, that could mean like role-playing kind of stuff in the classroom. I know that sounds hokey, but I think you got to start somewhere. What does it mean to actually have the words come out of your mouth? I need this to stop. Can you stop? How do you say that in a way where hopefully someone, like I said, it's hopefully a partner that you want to see again maybe, or that you don't think is a villain. Can you please stop? Like, what does it mean, or how does it feel? So I really think that any notion of queering consent and giving people tools to unlearn the heterosexual norms of consent requires community intervention for sure to give us the tools, but also just on our own end, for all of us, it's going to take practice and failure ultimately.
Thank you. So the next question I was thinking about, it's the experience that you talk about of Blue Buchanan, and also you talk about, so it's about an assault in a bathhouse, and then you talk about the interview with Dominic Morgan, that is from a more prison abolition perspective. So my question is, how do we make safe our spaces without policing, without having a logic of punishment?
Yeah, this is the million-dollar question, I think, and it's not easy. I think certainly spaces like Sauna Casanova or other bathhouses should train their staff to be able to know and identify situations where intervention might be necessary, but also how to intervene in a way that is de-escalating, meets people where they're at. Some people are not always in their right states of minds in that setting. You know, it requires a comprehensive set of tools. Posting signs, I know that's not perfect, but at least having, you know, an understanding of what the notions and norms around consent are in that space on the door and as you enter. A lot of interventions call for forms of community surveillance that I think are not always ideal. It's hard to understand how do we be our own forms of social control and policing without mirroring the police. So we do have to keep that in mind, but I think at least just training people who are working in these spaces, training each other, and having, certainly this conference, I hope, was one space where we're developing an understanding of these tools and skills. So I'm grateful that, you know, this kind of space exists to give people the idea to hear about the way that other people are having sex that you didn't even know was possible, right? You're like, cum dumps, I never heard of that. I mean, some of you I know have, but yeah, I think just having frank, honest, open conversations is one thing, training people who are working in these spaces, you know, but we also just have to acknowledge that not every space will have the same sets of, or norms around consent.
Thank you. So I will make you the last question from my side, and then I will open up. So you had like this image of, well, like police attacks that behind there is like this right wing attacking trans, queer, sex workers, right? And I was wondering what you think it might affect to our, I don't know, potential to consent, agency, and how we can answer back to that violence.
I think globally we are seeing an attack on bodily autonomy for both queer people and not, whether it comes to, in the United States, telling trans people they can't transition and putting barriers in place to do that, whether it's telling people that sex ought to look just one way and if you deviate from this norm you could go to prison. Those efforts to me are all the same. They are an effort to squash forms of pleasure, freedom, and liberation that queer people have spearheaded and championed, but it's not just us that will be impacted by these policies. But I think we just have to do more to connect those dots to see these things happening over here around police raids of gay bars, around consent or whatever, also connected more broadly to just, I don't know, I think of my mentor David Halperin in this interview he recently did. He said, being queer is about imagining a different way of being in the world and trying to make that world possible. And I think the right does not like us doing that, right? They do not want us reshaping this social world to have more pleasure for us. So anyways, I don't exactly know, I haven't figured out that puzzle myself, but I'm just looking out there and seeing all these attacks on autonomy. And to me, these enthusiastic consent rape laws are unfortunately could end up doing the same thing in restricting bodily autonomy and telling us the right and only way to be under a legal context. I don't know if that's satisfactory, but it's certainly to me, I think there's a global assault happening and we need tools to push back. And to me, bodily autonomy and freedom and pleasure and liberation, these concepts must be connected.
Yeah, I think it's quite like pointing towards how pleasure is valuable and why they want to destroy that, because it's so valuable. We can connect so much through there. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so I will open up right now. Do you have your plug? Yeah. Si algú vol fer-li alguna pregunta...
Hola. ¿Sí? Vale. Bueno, agradecer tu charla, agradecer la propuesta desde el Centre LGTBI, porque creo que es verdad que el consentimiento, o sea, que es un debate súper necesario, ¿no? Que además tenemos que llenar desde espacios como este, ¿no? Con discursos que rompan justo con lo que él planteaba también, ¿no? Esta criminalización que desde discursos se puede hacer de las prácticas que quiebran los marcos heteronormativos, de las prácticas BDSM, del sexo kinky, etcétera, etcétera. No puedo estar más de acuerdo. No puedo estar más de acuerdo con que los conceptos que en lo jurídico funcionan no tienen que funcionar ni en la prevención, ni en lo educativo, ni en nuestras relaciones cotidianas. Creo que cuando hablamos de lo jurídico y el consentimiento tiene un sentido muy concreto ahí y es problemático también. Sí quiero decir que creo que hay una aclaración que es importante y que ha generado mucha confusión en este marco geográfico, aquí en concreto, con la LOGILS, ¿no? Con la ley, y es que la ley no habla de consentimiento entusiasta, y esto creo que es importante. O sea, la ley habla de consentimiento afirmativo y es muy diferente, y eso creo que ha generado mucha confusión y por eso me he sentido un poco como interpelada a plantearlo y a ponerlo encima de la mesa, porque creo que es una de las problemáticas que nos está llevando a tener esta confusión entre lo que dice la ley. Y la ley no habla de consentimiento entusiasta, que no puedo estar más de acuerdo con que es un tipo de consentimiento que sirve para unas cosas muy concretas y es muy problemático para otras situaciones y que hay que repensar mucho más allá, pensar en consenso, pensar en un consentimiento que no reproduzca ni siquiera en la heterosexualidad los roles de género clásicos, ¿no? Huyamos de eso, por favor. Pero eso, creo que hay una confusión con el tema del consentimiento entusiasta. La ley habla de consentimiento afirmativo porque era necesario que, además del no es no, para todas aquellas situaciones donde hay la mal llamada sumisión química, la inmovilidad tónica, ¿no?, las situaciones de poder que no permitían una negativa, hacía falta a nivel legal que se ampliara eso, pero a ese nivel, ¿no? Entonces, gracias por puntualizar todo lo que eso no nos sirve, pero no confundamos el tema del consentimiento afirmativo con el consentimiento entusiasta, porque nos coloca en marcos muy diferentes. Y sí, yo creo que básicamente eso, o sea que me apetecía puntualizar esta parte.
Thank you. I appreciate that intervention. And, you know, I hesitated to speak about it at all because, of course, I am not from Spain or Catalonia. But, you know, California, for example, has moved to put these kind of informative models. So I think there is a broader trend towards this. But yes, of course, if you know more certainly than I do about the Spanish law. So, you know, I'm happy to defer to what locals believe and understand about their own law.
No, que tendría solo, no, así, no, que tenía solo dos planteamientos. Hablo en español porque así lo que se puede hacer. Porque hace 3 años hice también charlas sobre consentimiento en los bares, pero y lo que planteaba era básicamente no mirar hacia un tipo de consentimiento, el reglamento de consentimiento en la policía, cuanto directamente en el sexo. Entonces se planteaba directamente el consentimiento BDSM, con el reglamento del BDSM. Entonces, ¿cuánto puede ser? Según mí, nosotros pensamos que puede ser una solución por todo ese espacio, como la sauna, de tener ese tipo de reglamento que se tiene en las mazmorras, básicamente. Porque ahí es un sitio sexual, no con policía, pero el consentimiento es la base de todo. Y otro planteamiento es que se ha criminalizado muchísimo la policía, pero yo soy un ejemplo que en septiembre tuve una violencia de otro chico, tuve que llamar a la policía es súper presente. Estuvieron 4 horas cogiendo todos los datos aquí en Barcelona. No soy en Estados Unidos, obviamente no lo sé. A los 2 días me volví a llamar, me dieron un número directo, un mail directo, así que sí que son presentes y están siguiendo. El caso pasó el viernes, el domingo el juez nos llamó de urgencia en Ciudad de la Justicia. Así que no están abandonados como personas queer. Lo que pasa es que esa criminalización está aportando que la gente no quiere ir. Esto lo he visto también porque por la mañana he ido por la parte del cruising, donde hay muchísimas tiendas de personas que ya viven en la calle por MEF, por Tina, y tienen miedo de ir a la policía. No conocen tampoco los derechos. Hay personas ahí dentro que no conocen ni a Katy y son personas refugiadas. Y si fueran la policía, seguramente le harían dado todo ese folleto. Entonces, ¿cuánto está ayudando el hecho de la policía del diablo? Y nos vamos por ahí.
Vamos a recoger varias para que así pueda hablar y contestarlas juntas, ¿vale? So we're going to collect many questions, so then after.
Va millor anglès o català?
Hi ha traducció, llavors.
English works. You talked about the way this kind of sex puritanism is limiting our bodily expression, and you talked about pushing back, and I think we all can imagine what pushing back against the right means and what fighting the right means, but I'm very I don't know myself how to work with when this pushback is coming from what feels like our side, especially the TERF movement and TERF discourse and the whole crowd of kink not belonging at Pride, and these people who are like next to us and use our words and are in like our institutions and universities and like groups. I have no, like, I'm just wondering if you know, how do we push back against these people? Because it clearly cannot be the same strategy as we use against the right, which, like the boogeyman, right?
Okay, so vamos a hacer otra, la última, y luego pasamos, we are going to have another one, and then we do 3 and 3.
Well, thank you for your speech. I'm also an educator. I'm also queer, but not with a Q, with a C, because there's also an inflection on that word. And I also worry about my students because they often come, and the training we often have, and I include myself, has been also porn, which we know is a representation of patriarchy and racism and colonialism. And I was interested in this proposal of yours of teaching not only the verbal, but also the non-verbal. However, I want you to develop that idea because I find it problematic. Because that would mean that gesture is universal. And therefore, we have to teach those gestures. And I remember one book that I recommend to you. I don't know if it's translated, though. It's by this Colombian writer, Fernando Vallejo. He goes with his cousin to the Imperial Bathhouse, I think it's the name in New York. And they are Latinos who are laughing and talking, which happens a lot in the sauna as well. And they get almost criminalized and kicked out of the sauna because of that. Therefore, this race and I'm going to say colonial reality is also shaping gesture. So I would like to understand from your perspective, as probably in your university there's different races, different origins, different nationalities. How are you teaching those gestures without universalizing the gesture itself?
Contestamos estas tres y luego... So, yeah, whenever you want, and then we continue.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the gestures, I would be fired from my job if I was teaching my kids what gestures to use. I mean, just to be clear, like, I can't actually do sex education. I'm teaching about sex education, if that makes sense. Of course, gestures vary. I'm not, it's not supposing that there should be a universal language prescribed or any prescription, more just teaching that, you know, that also look for nonverbal cues, and those may vary. They may be this or this or this. Just to be aware of those things, because I think that people expect it to come in verbal form. You know, there's just all the conversation about consent, I think, has been focused on words. I'm not suggesting we should come up with another set of universal prescriptions around gestures, just that acknowledge that you should be reading your partner's body language, you know, period. Whatever that is, I'm not suggesting there's one form of body language, just please, like, pay attention, what to look out for, things that could come up. So that's kind of what I mean, not literally like, you know, these are the forms. But I agree that it's not easy, obviously, and it is very tough when you're working with diverse groups to, you know, across separate sets of norms. Is the right wing and TERF movements separate? I don't know. I mean, to me, they are similarly attacking bodily autonomy. That's what I think. I would just want us to shift our understanding of politics away from right and left wing, because I think there's something else going on here too that is broader and more insidious than that. And it's about telling us how to live. I mean, I think that's fundamentally what, you know, TERF folks want to tell people how to live, right? They want to tell them you can't be this way. Queer people are saying we want to be this way. Like, what is the problem with us living our true free lives? Like, what is it doing to you? To me, that's just where my mind goes at, that I don't see them as separate at all. Like, I see them as part of the same kind of impulse to tell people how to live. And that's, I guess, I want a language to talk about, is to reorient us from, certainly in the United States, from Democrat versus Republican, because plenty of Democrats in the United States context are deeply punitive when it comes to sex. they've moved on from things like the drug war, but when it comes to sex, they're ready to throw us all in jail, Democrats and Republicans. It's not a partisan issue to me. I think it's something else. It's a different axis, if that makes sense. And we need, the struggle for freedom continues, and we just need to name it, I think, and call it something else so that we can shake off these. To me, it just doesn't quite describe it well to call it left versus right wing, because as you say, like, you know, TERFs kind of have, we're not really clear. Like, what are, to me, it's a different axis, I guess. That's how I'm thinking about it. I don't know if that's helpful, but just the demand for bodily autonomy, I think that's, we just need to develop language about, like, we should be able to live the lives we want to live. I mean, I just feel like that, just creating a language to talk about that would be key. And oh my gosh, yes, so what I heard from you is that police intervened in a way that you felt good about. Yeah, I mean, that's amazing. What a wonderful story, what a refreshing story, because I don't hear stories like that almost ever in the United States in my context. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Yeah. Certainly, I was the victim of domestic violence, and the police were called in that situation, and I believe saved my life. So I have a complicated relationship with the police, right? But what happened after was not great. But the fact that they stopped the violence, you know, I don't know. You know, what do I do with that, right? Like, it's complicated. Yeah, it's complicated.
Hi havia una al fons, crec. No? Ah. Ha dit que no al final. Sí, sí. Hi havia una més? No?
Yeah, how do we move from suffering sexual violence occasionally to being a victim of violence? Because it seems to me that you may have experienced sexual violence, but you don't feel a victim of sexual violence. And sometimes that's a very fine line, which I would like my students to understand, that you can be, hopefully you won't be, a recipient of violence, but still that doesn't make you a victim, shouldn't make you feel a victim. But you can be also a victim of it. So what's the difference between suffering sexual violence and being a victim of sexual violence?
I mean, just speaking to that story I just told, right? I don't tell that story a lot. There's a lot of pressure to claim that victim title, right? Like, I think that people want me to say that and to lead with that. And it doesn't, to me, it just doesn't fully feel like my story. I'm not saying that it's not other people's story, right? It's just, it is a difficult question. I think it's, like, please write a book about that. Like, I would love to read that book. Because I think we're desperate for it, because these labels of perpetrator and victim, I think in this life, we are not going to get out of it with probably not being a perpetrator or a victim at some point. This binary is a little artificial, you know? I'm not saying it's, you know, but we are pushed to claim the victim role, but we are never pushed to claim the perpetrator role. And I think many of us, whether we knew it or not, probably people have walked away from having sex with me feeling like I did something they didn't like. That is definitely true. There's no question. But I guess we're just not called to interrogate those in situations in the same way. And I do think there is something there that we need to move beyond this binary of perpetrator and victim to some extent, and acknowledge that we are human, imperfect, and we fail. Violence, I can't imagine a life without violence, right? Like, it's like how life is almost just like that's embedded in our systems and our ways of life. So I don't know. I really appreciate the question. Like I said, if you find a book on that question, I really want to read it because I think it's an important one. Thank you.
So thank you so much for being here and to start the day today with you. I think it has opened a lot of questions that will continue with us the next day. So thank you for everyone to come here i ens veiem d'aquí 5 minuts en aquesta sala.
Hola, abans de marxar, en 15-20 minuts començarà la propera taula.